Let's talk some truth about the US-Canada trade deficit. Who's really winning? For anyone who's been following the recent American political discussion on trade policy, you've likely heard politicians claim that America is currently losing to Canada because of a trade deficit.
I don't know. Like you said with Mexico. We have big deficits with Canada, like we do with all countries. I mean, I look at some of the deals made, I say, who the hell made these deals that's so bad?
In 2023, the United States had a trade deficit of $41 billion with their neighbor from the north, with $482 billion in imports from Canada and $441 billion in exports from the U.S. to Canada. The argument presented recently by the American government is that the U.S. buys more from Canada than it sells in return, making it seem like Canada is getting the better deal. The claim is that it seems as if the U.S. is actually subsidizing its northern neighbor. But this framing is overly simplistic and deeply misleading. Just recently, the newly elected 47th President of the United States claimed that the U.S. subsidizes Canada to the tune of $200 billion per year.
Why are we supporting a country $200 billion plus a year? Our military is at their disposal, all of these other things.
It's unclear where this number is derived. In any event, rather than a subsidy, the U.S. trade deficit is a byproduct of U.S. economic outperformance relative to other countries. Okay, so why is it that the deficit isn't a loss for the U.S. at all? And how is it really a sign of economic strength? The claim by politicians is that because the U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada, it implies that it's somehow taking advantage of the United States. But what if I told you that's not actually true? Regardless if the claim is meant to be misleading or not, it's important to understand a few basic things about how this important trade relationship actually works. The truth is that the trade relationship between Canada and the United States is the most integrated and comprehensive in the world and benefits both countries' prosperity. Let's discuss the specifics and why it's not actually a bad thing for the U.S. at all. Canada's economy is heavily based on natural resources, things like oil, lumber, minerals, and other raw materials. These products require little to no processing before being exported. And guess who buys most of them? The United States. The U.S. buys these resources in bulk, and that's where things start to get interesting. Unlike Canada, the U.S. doesn't just sell raw materials. It turns them into high-value finished goods. Cars, electronics, furniture, refined fuels, you name it. The U.S. then sells these products worldwide, including back to Canada. This means that while the U.S. does import a lot from Canada, it makes far more money on the products it exports, because manufactured goods have much higher profit margins than raw materials. So, when politicians claim that the U.S. is losing to Canada in trade, they're leaving out a key fact. The U.S. isn't just selling to Canada, it's selling to the entire world. Even though the U.S. buys raw materials from Canada, its overall trade balance remains positive because it exports valuable manufactured goods to many other countries. Canada, on the other hand, has fewer options. It relies heavily on selling raw materials to the U.S. and then buying back more expensive finished products. This is why Canada often runs a trade deficit. It has to export way more in volume just to afford the finished goods it buys from the U.S. In other words, the trade deficit isn't a sign of U.S. weakness. It's proof that the U.S. dominates the value-added side of the economy. Canada must sell a much higher volume to afford the high-priced products it buys, such as machinery, electronics, and pharmaceuticals. And that's why the idea that the U.S. is subsidizing Canada is misleading. The U.S. isn't losing. It's profiting from the fact that it controls the most lucrative part of the supply chain. So next time you hear a politician complain about the trade deficit with Canada, remember, it's not Canada that's winning. It's the U.S. that's making far more money by transforming resources into high-value goods and selling them across the world. But the U.S. isn't the only country that operates this way. Look at China, one of the world's biggest manufacturing economies. It imports massive amounts of raw materials from places like Australia, South America, and Africa, because you can't be a manufacturing superpower without a steady supply of resources. Take lumber as an example. Canada exports massive amounts of raw timber to the U.S. At first glance, it looks like the U.S. is simply spending money and running a deficit. But what happens next? That raw Canadian wood gets processed into high-end furniture, construction materials, and even paper products, many of which are then sold not just within the U.S., but to other countries around the world at a much higher value. So while Canada gets paid for selling raw logs, the US makes far more profit by turning those logs into finished goods. That's the real power of a manufacturing economy. And it's exactly why the trade deficit isn't the loss that some politicians make it out to be. That's exactly what the US is doing, but with one key advantage. Instead of relying on politically unstable regions, it gets its raw materials from Canada, a close ally with ethical, well-regulated resource industries. If the US wants to maintain a strong manufacturing base, it actually needs a country like Canada, one that provides reliable, high-quality resources without the geopolitical risks of dealing with countries like Russia or China. So rather than seeing the trade deficit as a loss, think of it as a strategic advantage. The US gets to manufacture high-value goods while securing its supply chain from a stable, friendly neighbor. And in the world of global trade, that's a win.